Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fantasy Football Scouts' first Sky Sports fantasy video for the season, that being the 21-22 season. As you can see, I am greeted by a new guest for this season, and that is Niall Murphy himself. Niall, how are you doing?
I am very good, thanks, Luke. I'm just trying to avoid sunburn, so I'm in the house.
You look very bright at the moment. I don't know if that's because of the sun or whatnot, but yeah, you're definitely going to need some cream soon, it looks like.
This is just my natural complexion.
Sorry, start off offending you straight away. That's a good way to start, isn't it? Okay, so yeah, Joe was obviously on the videos last season. He's not going to be this season. Niall's going to be filling in for the whole time. Obviously, we thank Joe for his input, but Niall as well comes with a really good record that we'll get onto in a second. I'm going to introduce myself first of all. You guys probably know me if you've watched these videos over the course of the last few seasons. So Luke Williams, sometimes known as Disable on the forums from back in the day. I've been playing Sky Fantasy Football. I think pretty much since it came out. I can't really be sure because obviously when you start, you don't really check the history at that point. I think it was very close to when it first started anyway. Um, Kind of always seen it as my main game, really. It's been the one I've had the most fun and enjoyment out of. Done pretty well over the seasons. Quite a few top hundreds or sort of in and around there over the course of that time, with my best ever finish being fourth, which might sound impressive, but the man across the other way there has beat me by one place. Niall, do you want to introduce yourself properly?
Thanks very much, Luke. Yeah, so my name is Niall Murphy. I've been playing the Sky game for quite a long time. I think this is probably my seventh or eighth season, going back a little while. Like you, I've never really got into FPL. No disrespect, of course, to FPL. Um, I've played it for a couple of seasons early on when I first started playing fantasy football. And I think people would describe FPL as a gateway drug to the harder stuff, and this is definitely the harder stuff, right? So, Sky as a game, I would say, is the fantasy football players' fantasy football game. It requires It requires a lot more effort. It requires you to really get elbow deep into fixtures a little bit more than you would do with the other games, just because you've got a captain on every single match day of football,
Mm.
which is particularly pronounced last year. But anyway, my best finishes, I think, have been third was my absolute best finish the season that Chelsea won the league after the year after the Leicester miracle.
Right, yeah.
And since then, I've had a 15th, a 17th, I think one in the 40s, and then last season I finished. So I'm claiming a top 100 last season, but I think I actually finished 101st, but I finished with the same points as the person who finished 99th. So come on, that surely counts.
Yeah, I think that definitely counts, to be fair. Yeah, I think I dropped out of the top 100 by the end of the season. I didn't even want to open the app to look, but I was at 23rd, I think was my highest. But my big downfall last season was definitely transfer planning, which is something we're going to talk about here. I kind of mismanaged my transfers a little bit. So even someone who's played it for as long as me can get that wrong, and that is definitely one of the harder sort of facets of the game. Okay, so in terms of our plans for the season, we'll try to bring you one of these videos pretty much on a weekly basis. Obviously, there might be times when that's not required or we've got other commitments, but generally we're looking at a sort of one a week. And myself and Niall will also be writing an article for Fantasy Football Scout throughout the season, probably every sort of 2 weeks. We'll probably rotate that, so one a month. Just really, we're not sure where we want to take that yet, but it's probably just going to be our thoughts basically spilled out on the page. Not so much just looking directly at our teams, but more, some things that we could look at in the fixtures, some things we've noticed, etc. We'll sort of play it as it happens on that. This video in particular is going to be more of almost a beginner's guide, I would say, or an introduction to the new Sky guys that want to get involved. I've seen a lot of people contacting me on Twitter, on various platforms, just asking me to do some sort of beginner's guide. So it's not quite a beginner's guide, but we're just going to touch on some of the rule differences and the usual stuff that we should do at the beginning of the season, really. And obviously, as we move forward throughout the campaign, we'll get a lot more into the nitty gritty. So yeah, I suppose probably for me the biggest, well, one of the big changes from FPL, which is probably most people's prime game, is the fact that we don't really have, well, we don't at all, I should say, have a bench. So not having a bench sort of plays into the rule that everyone knows that you're supposed to have nailed players in fantasy football. Now, I feel like that's getting challenged more and more as we move on, because a lot of the biggest teams have such ridiculously good squads that sometimes their squad players can actually outscore nailed players. But when it comes to Sky and you just don't have that bench at all, and you're really relying on that person to play on a specific day, it feels even more so that you just need to have nailed players. And as a result, I will rarely consider anyone that I don't consider to be nailed at all. And even if it's just like a little bit of doubt, sometimes that can be to the detriment of me. But that's kind of a thing that I have in the back of my mind. Do you feel the same way there, Noel?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You're totally right. I think when you've not got a bench, you've got to make sure that your players are starting as many games as possible. Now, obviously, the tricky thing about that is that the best teams in the most recent years, thinking about Manchester City in particular, they're rotating their players week in, week out. And so that's why someone like Diaz last year, who was just an absolute stick on in that team, a rare stick on in that team, someone who played every single week, just became gold. And so it's about picking players who are going to play week in, week out, but at the same time, where players are not going to play week in, week out, trying to pick players who are going to play at least 80, 90% of the time, because if they're not playing, you're getting nothing generally. And that particularly hits home when you're banking on players to be your captain on a single match day or on a day when captain options are really, really sparse. So yeah, golden rule I would say is pick a team that containing players that are going to start first and foremost. Now, obviously, nobody knows who's going to start every single game, but you get the gist of it quite early on. And one of the great things about Sky is that you've got two overhauls, one at the start of the season, which we'll get on to, which is like a forced wild card after the third week of the game. So hopefully you'll have enough time in the first 3 weeks of the season to take stock of what's happened so far, who's going to be starting, who's not, who's playing well, and then you can set your team up for the long haul after that short power play. So definitely, I think that's probably the golden rule, just thinking about players that are going to play most of the games.
Definitely, yeah. And sometimes, obviously, we all need some cheap players to fill in the gaps, and sometimes these cheap players will come with a risk that they're not 100% nailed. But yeah, that's where I'll always try and weigh that up and probably look at their minutes, and obviously transfers and things are yet to come in the game. So we're not going to delve too much in players in this podcast, but we will as we move forward, I assure you, and sort of highlight the players that we really like the look of. Another big change for me is the fact that there's a limit on transfers in FPL. Obviously, you do have unlimited transfers in a way. We know you have to take a -4 if you want to take that extra one, which is obviously a bit of a pain and you don't want to do it, but it's quite a useful sort of thing to fall back on if you're just really not happy with your team, or you get loads of injuries in a week, or for whatever reason you can fix it. Like, they're a little bit more throwaway, whereas in Sky you literally have that 40 for the whole season outside of these overhauls, these forced wildcards. And managing those transfers, as I touched on the start, is a real key part of the Sky game, and often something that new players will struggle to get to grips with. They're so precious is basically the bottom line. And getting your team right from the start for me is a big part of it. Now, that's not necessarily from the start for these first 3 weeks that we have to focus on. It's probably from the first overhauls when we really need to start looking at that. But managing transfers is tricky. What have you had any particular tactic over the seasons of managing your transfers now?
Yep, so amongst the people who I know, I've become quite notorious for holding on to my transfers, sometimes to my detriment, but really being prudent with the transfer usage in the early months of the season. I think it was more difficult last year because of the coronavirus pandemic, right? The games were on Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and so you're having to get captaincies covered throughout that whole run of games. But it looks like this year we're returning back to more of a traditional model where most of the games are at 3 p.m. on a Saturday, which means that there's less match days, individual match days overall.
Yeah,
And
lovely.
so really, I think I'll be hopefully going back to my original formula, which is tightening the purse strings a little bit between October, November into December, and hoping to get to the latter stages of the season still flush with transfers, so you can really attack those rearranged matches which tend to come later in the year, and those single match days which can be so lucrative in this game. So
Yeah.
that's my approach. But I know that you've totally different, and you've had a lot of success in the game too. So just because that's something I do doesn't mean that that's the right approach. I mean, some people really use transfers at the start of the season and steal a march, and then everyone else who's not used them is playing catch up for the rest of the year, and they're depending on things going their way. If things go your way early on and you use transfers, then that can be a good way of doing it as well. I just think sometimes you've not got the whole picture at the start of the season,
Mm.
and you don't know ultimately if there's going to be masses of chaos later in the year. And so having them can be to your advantage. I mean, I'll give you an example without rambling on. 2 seasons ago, obviously the football got postponed or got cancelled for a few months because of the pandemic.
Mm.
And when we returned, nobody could have predicted that was going to happen. But when we returned, all of the games were spread out, and those who'd held on to their transfers were at a massive advantage. I think that season I went from being way down in the rankings, over 300-400 going into the last few weeks, which obviously that's a decent enough ranking, but in the context of winning the game, it wasn't, and I managed to get myself into the top 20. So it just shows that having those transfers, that was a massive stroke of luck. But there are going to be seasons where lots of games get rearranged, so having them later on in the year can be a big advantage too.
And that's it. I mean, using transfers is generally a good thing because you don't. I mean, it's no worse feeling than feeling like a player's going to. There's a really good, great game. Kevin De Bruyne's at home to Norwich. You really think he's going to haul in the game. You don't do it because you want to conserve transfers, and then he absolutely smashes it a haul in. There's no worse feeling in the game for me that you've decided against it and it actually happens, rather than the other way around. And I think the value of a transfer is better when you've got more games for it to work. So, if you've got 10 games left and you make a transfer, there are potentially 10 games for that player to make up for it, especially if the person you bought out was, out for the season or whatnot. So there is that asset, like that facet, sorry, but like you said, it can work the other way, and every season is different in that regard. Where sometimes the players that do well from the start are still playing really well at the end. There isn't too much rotation. Man City haven't won the league with 10 games to go. So there's all sorts of factors. I think the general rule that I like to stick to is there's 40 transfers. There's roughly 38 weeks. If you're on par for sort of one a week across the season, you can't go too far wrong. I do think that with the overhaul at the start, you can maybe afford to save a few. You could probably have to use a few more around Christmas when you've got more fixtures, maybe a little bit more rotation, and then probably a few more at the end when certain teams have tied up the league or whatnot. But as a general rule, that's what I try to stick to, roughly one a week, and I think that's served me well over the years anyway. I was going to touch on overhaul, but I think you've mentioned that it's essentially a forced wildcard, which happens after the first 3 weeks. Now, that is really significant. The other one is in February usually, but we kind of can ignore that for now. Why it's such a big factor is pretty much if you're making your team and building your drafts at the moment, we are simply just looking at those first 3 weeks. There is literally no point looking beyond that at all. You want to completely construct your team around these first 3 opening fixtures. For these teams, and that heavily shapes a lot of the Sky teams. I think I'm not sure how many people play Sky overall. Sometimes it's around sort of the 700,000-800,000 mark. I do wonder how many of the people actually pay attention to that fact. So that alone puts you ahead of the crowd straight away, I think, if you're just looking at those first 3 weeks. So is there any particular sort of players or teams, I should say, that take your fancy for the first 3 weeks? Well, we can drop that in now if you like.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that one of the best things that you can do is go onto Fantasy Football Scout and have a good look at the fixture ticker. If you can sort it out just to the number of game weeks that are relevant, in this case, just 3. So if Man United have got a great home game in the 4th match week, just completely ignore it. At this point, you're not even thinking about that. You want to just be looking at the teams that have got good fixtures. Obviously, you want to make sure you're getting a mixture of the best teams in there too, and looking at the way that the games lie in terms of match days. So you'll see that the first game of the season is Brentford versus Arsenal on a Friday night. So you're going to need a Brentford or an Arsenal player to cover that match. I mean, you could skip it if you want, but I mean, it's not much fun, I would say. You're starting a new game, a new year, missing the first match day. And there are decent enough options from both those teams. But in terms of the teams that are coming out top in terms of the fixtures at the start of the season, Aston Villa have got good games. I mean, they've got Watford away, Newcastle at home, and then Brentford at home. So that's a really good start. Some of the players there, I mean, Emi Martinez, the goalkeeper, obviously had a brilliant year last year. Yeah. His price is still pretty good. Brighton's fixtures are the second best according to the ticker. And Lewis Dunk, absolute bane of my season last year. I don't really want to talk that much about him. I've not probably recovered from that yet. But he's someone who can pick up the bonuses that we haven't talked about yet, but passing bonuses, tackle bonuses, and he can even score goals from centre-back. He could be a good option with Burnley, Watford at home, and Everton at home as well. And then thinking about some of the bigger teams, Liverpool are up there, Leicester, Man United are up there. So, I think you just want to take a bit of time, look at those first three game weeks, think about who you want to captain on each of the match days. And another strategy that people have done in the past is to double or even triple up on defenses. Just looking at this purely as a power play, and focusing in on those teams that have got the best fixtures is absolutely the way to go, I would say. I don't know if you've got any other advice there, Luke.
Yeah, no, I echo that. I mean, for me, the fixtures are obviously pretty much all we've got to go on. Obviously, you'll have pre-season, past history of teams, but I often think in the first 3 weeks, teams are often finding their feet a little bit. Some crazy results can happen. I think that's sometimes down to the fitness of the teams. Everyone's at different stages. You've obviously got players that are coming back from international tournaments. You've got all sorts of other factors that we bear in mind as fantasy managers. So sometimes I think we can get a little bit sidetracked by the fixtures in the opening few weeks. And for me, as long as Norwich are right there on at the bottom, playing Liverpool, Man City, they've just come up, and Leicester. I mean, the obvious thing for me is that you're just not touching them. So some of the guys right near the bottom, I would just completely write off, and I don't think it's too much of a problem to pick sort of decent teams in sort of the mid area in terms of fixtures, because they could surprise you. So that's what I'd say. Also, we do actually get two teams. For people who don't realise, you have an A team and a B team. There's no sort of penalty for doing that. In fact, it's recommended. I wouldn't even necessarily call one your A and B, so to speak. You've just got two teams, and you've almost got two goes at this, especially at the beginning of the overhaul. So what I've often done in the past is what you've said there, is double or tripled or even quadrupled up on a defence from a team, and just hope that they get 2 or 3 clean sheets in the opening 3 weeks, which can really sort of set you in front. Obviously, you still need to think about your captains and your individual days that we'll get onto in a bit, but looking at a block Brighton or a block Aston Villa defence from the start, they're quite easily affordable, and that kind of makes sense to me. So that's probably what I look to do, and maybe not just in the B team. I'll say it might be in the A team as well, because every time we get to the overhaul, the teams right near the top have really gone all eggs in basket. 9 times out of 10. I think Huddersfield even did it one year, crazily. I think it was 3 out of 4 clean sheets. The overhaul was actually after 4 weeks, and teams that went crazy on Huddersfield were right up there. So anything can happen. Other things that are slightly different on the Sky game, I think there's more players available for us to pick as a result of the scoring system. You touched on it about bonus. Defenders, goalkeepers, midfielders, forwards, they can all get bonus points. Some are better than others in certain areas. Do you want to talk to us briefly about some of the areas these players can get bonus points now?
Sure. Yeah. So there are some teams that are brilliant at churning out bonus points. Manchester City's defenders are consistently knocking the ball around between them. Now, in FPL, it might be quite boring to watch and frustrating to watch, but in Sky, you've got your little clicker out counting every pass. If they get 60, they get 2 bonus points. If they get 70, they get 3. And Diaz last season pretty much got it in every single game that he stepped onto the pitch. So you're starting the game on 5 points often with some of these players from a passing perspective. Tackling is a little bit more fickle and difficult to predict. And also they've changed it from 2 seasons ago. It's attempted tackles rather than successful tackles. Sometimes it's hard to tell which is which. But I think for every 4 attempted tackles, you're getting 2 points, and for every 5, you're getting 3. And sometimes players who you wouldn't expect to be getting tackles pick them up. I remember Danny Ings used to get it quite frequently as a striker. And then up front, a lot of the players that the real flat track bullies, Salah, Kane, these guys are picking up shot bonus. 2 shots on target is 2 points, and 3 shots on target is 4 shots on target is 3. So you've got these guys who can pick up a double, and you're turning 2 goals into a major haul with man of the match and the bonus points added on too. So yeah, targeting those players who might not be the most glamorous in terms of assists and goals can really pay dividends at the end of the season. I mean, I'm just looking last year at the midfielders, and the midfielders again this year are pretty slim pickings. Højbjerg finished 5th overall in midfielders last year.
Mental.
And I think he only got 1 goal, maybe a few assists, but that's because he was passing the ball around, he was making tackles, and he was consistently playing. So thinking about players like that, I think that adds a different dimension to the Sky game, and that actually, if you've got someone in that midfield who's consistently knocking the ball around, picking up those bonus points, it can be just as good at the end of the season having them as it could do having somebody even like Jack Grealish. So that's something to consider. And I think in the coming episodes that we record between now and the start of the season, we'll really do some deep dives into the players who we think could be taking over on those bonus points.
Definitely, and I think Sky have almost got more wise to this as they've gone on, because these players used to be a lot cheaper. They almost undervalued this, and you had like Harry Arter and people like that at sort of 6 million sort of price, and Idrissa Gueye from Everton in the past. I can think of there's numerous others that were, probably about a million or even 2 million than say Højbjerg now, who's 8.1, and they were still getting numbers fairly close to this. But now they've smartened up to it. Think Rodri, Højbjerg, Fabinho, all these guys, they're all around the same price, where it looks like they still could be value though, to be fair. So it's definitely a thought process. I just like the way that it opens up the game to more options in midfield, which it does need to do, because Sky actually puts a lot of midfielders in FPL term as forwards, so Salah being a forward, for example. So there needs to be more options in that respect for me. Generally, for me, just as a general tip there, I find that, and I don't know how you feel now, but passing bonus for centre-backs is probably one of the most lucrative avenues for bonus points. Now, some midfielders like your Jorginhos and your Rodri will get it, every time they take to the pitch, but obviously they don't get points for clean sheets. They're only going to get it for goals and assists. Generally, they don't get too many of those. So they can still be good value, but the centre-backs such as Diaz and Van Dijk, who can pick up 15 to 20 clean sheets, maybe can hit 4 or 5 goals, and are obviously churning out this 3 points bonus pretty much every week they play. They have the potential to be absolute superstars. So don't be put off by the fact that these defenders are really high prices, because they're incredibly reliable as well. You can almost write Diaz down now for, assuming he doesn't get injured and he plays like 35 games, you can pretty much write him down for 200 points again straight away, if not more. So that's what's really good. And trying to fit as many of these guys in your team is obviously harder. Sky have got wise to it now, and it is a lot harder. So yeah, that's definitely a tip for me that I think's worked. We'll touch on man of the match. This is the bane of a lot of Sky managers' existence. To be honest with you, it's an interesting feature, because the Sky match reporter will actually just pick the man of the match from the game, and there's a different reporter on every single game, so you're kind of at their hands as to who gets it. Generally, it used to be 5 points, it's now 3 points, so there's a little bit of a luck factor there. However, I think there's some skill to sort of working out who can be man of the match. Have you sort of used anything in the past to work out who you think is going to be man of the match in the games, or is it just very much luck for you now?
It's probably the least scientific part of the game,
Yeah.
but there's I don't know, a lot of people hate it. I wouldn't say I like it, but there's a certain charm to it that does make a game worth watching till the end, or checking the match reports after it. Often, I would say that I've not done any analysis on this, but I would say if you're young and you're English as a player, you're far more likely to get man of the match. So that's something to always look out for. I remember when Dele Alli was coming through, he was churning out man of the match after man of the match. So that's something to bear in mind. Some people are media darlings, but there's often no reason or rhyme to it, and it can be massively frustrating when you're watching a game and the player that you've got captain has been dancing around the opposition. He's been the standout player by an absolute country mile, and Alan Smith on the comms decides that he's going to give it to someone who's barely featured. You just got to take that. Over the course of the season, you hope that the ones that go against you will even out with the ones that go with you. But I reckon if you did a sample of most Sky managers, I reckon most of them would tell you that they've had some terrible decisions going against them, and they won't remember the ones that went in their favour. But okay. There is, when there's a lot on the line too, I think it can get incredibly frustrating. But it is what it is, and that's the game, and just deal with it.
Yeah, I agree. And at the end of the day, you've usually got 10 fixtures a week usually, and we might go 3 or 4 weeks before you see one. Do you know what I mean? Where it's slightly iffy. They're generally pretty good overall, I think. I don't think it's that bad. Obviously, when they are bad, it's highly noticeable is all. And like you said before, when we had almost COVID football, I want to call it, there was more individual days where the games are on TV. Do you know what I mean? So you're able to analyse their decisions more. Whereas Saturday 3 p.m. now we've got 7-8 games. We're largely going off of match reports of what people are saying anyway. So probably won't be so much as a factor. But I think as a general rule in the past, they kind of like the people who are easy on the eye, like you said about dancing around there. So think of your Jack Grealishes, if he's dancing around the opposition for fun. he can actually be a good player to pick just because he's the star man of that team. Eden Hazard used to eat man of the matches for breakfast all across the game. So there's a few players out there that you could probably think of right now that even if they fail to return, I mean, St. Maximin, for example, will get it for Newcastle pretty much if Newcastle do anything, I would have thought. So, yeah, there's a little bit of science to it, but there we go. I think we've covered most about the differences from FPL. Is there anything else you can think of we've not touched on, Niall? I think we've covered it all, or?
Yeah, I think we've covered most of it. There is just one thing that hasn't changed this year that I think a lot of people were hoping would, is that goalkeepers still get a penalty save if the ball if the ball goes over the bar or goes wide. So that's something that hasn't been changed, to many people's dismay. But no, other than that, I think the bonus system works really well, and it just keeps you engaged and interested, and it also just unlocks a huge plethora of different players that you would never have thought of before. So that's definitely a good thing.
I totally agree. Okay, I'm looking at my agenda down here, and you've written for me 2021 quiz. So I've not prepared for this. Are you going to hit me with some questions?
I'm going to hit you with some very, very simple questions. I'll be surprised if you don't get them all right, because I know how much you love this game.
No pressure.
I was going to simply ask you to look back upon last season, and tell me who you think the highest scoring goalkeeper, defender, midfielder, and striker were from memory, no checking.
I was going to
So
say.
let's start with the goalkeeper.
I was looking earlier, so I've kind of already cheated a little bit on this. I know that Martinez was either first or second, so I'm going to say Martinez straight away for goalkeeper.
Yeah, okay, that's right. He was number one. He was 9 points better off than Ederson,
which is crazy,
231,
really.
which is it's a huge number of points for a goalkeeper. But goalkeepers can be real assets. If you get a good goalkeeper and they're keeping clean sheets, they get more points for a clean sheet than a defender gets. Throw in some save bonus onto that, and you can get 11, 12 point hauls pretty consistently from a goalkeeper if you manage to latch onto a string of clean sheets. So that's something to think about, and especially when you've got Martinez, who alongside Grealish was their best player probably last season. He picked up a few man of the match awards as well. So yeah, goalkeepers 100% a position that you can afford to spend a little bit more on. I know traditionally people were trying to save budget with keepers, and you can certainly do that. But if you've got somebody who's performing week in, week out like Martinez was last year, that did help that he was cheap too. But even this season, he's a little bit more. I would see no reason to go to avoid him, because given his price increase. So moving on to defenders then. I mean, this one we've talked quite extensively about this already, but you should be able to get this going.
Yeah, this is Diaz. I don't even need to think about this one. It's definitely Diaz. I'm confident it's Diaz anyway.
Yeah, it's Diaz. Comfortably Diaz. He actually scored less points than Martinez, but I think he had a string of games where he was injured. He got 229, which was 28 higher than second place. Although that said, Stuart Dallas, who is now a midfielder in the game, would have actually been the second highest scoring defender last season, and he came in at 6.3. So just shows if you're a cheap defender that he's out of position at the same time, but he was also getting bonus week in, week out. There really are some often cheap gems that unearth themselves that just absolutely underpin the rest of your squad, because it means you can go off and afford the Salahs and Kanes. And so that's exactly the kind of player we're hoping to look for this season. And in some of the upcoming episodes, we'll be doing some deep dives into those players in particular.
And on that note, I just want to say you've already highlighted to me probably another key difference is that in FPL you generally want a captain. If it's not a striker, it's usually going to be one of your power midfielders that's pretty much a striker. So your Salahs and your Brunos, of course, stuff like that. But in Sky, you can captain goalkeepers, defenders, you name it, and they can do extremely well because of this bonus point system. I mean, goalkeepers in particular that you said there, it's pretty much 11 points for a clean sheet most of the time. And if you've got that for a single match day captain, that's 22 points. That's a massive haul. I think something like 10 of the top 20 or even more value players at the end of the season were actually goalkeepers. And it wasn't just because they were cheap, it was because they had ridiculously high scores. So goalkeeper is definitely a very good position. And defenders, I see it's almost like midfielders in this game are sort of the last position now, where in the past in Sky it wasn't quite like that. So midfielders used to be the sort of power spot, but because of the way the bonus systems work now, your goalkeepers are great, defenders are great, your forwards can be great, not always, but sometimes, and then the midfield is somewhat lacking, apart from a certain man, as I'm assuming you asked me who was the highest scorer midfielder, so I'm just going to go straight in and say Bruno Fernandes without thinking. I hope that's right.
Correct. No, you're absolutely spot on. He got 270 points, which is obviously massive. And again, he comes in this season at 11.8, which is a pretty decent increase on last year. Um, I know we're not talking about players at the moment, but is he someone who's going to be featuring for you, do you think, this year again? Is he an absolute stickler in your team, just given he's one of the best players in the game?
Yeah, so despite me just saying the midfield is like the poorest area, it's actually the best area if you have a player like Bruno Fernandes, as he's shown with like 270 points. If you can find those attacking midfielders that can get shots on target, they obviously get the extra point for the goal, but more so that they can actually be involved in all the set pieces. So looking for man of the match because they're the star person doing everything on the pitch, and more importantly, get the passing and the tackle bonus occasionally, which strikers will almost never get you. So they can literally hit every single point scoring column and therefore rack up crazy hauls. I mean, sometimes like a De Bruyne or a Bruno Fernandes only need to hit like one assist or like one goal in a game, and they've got man of the match, passing bonus, tackle bonus, shots on target bonus. It's crazy. They can hit stupidly good hauls. So it's a real balance in midfield, a real tricky area, because outside of Bruno and De Bruyne, it's very hard to work out for me who will be those other guys that can sort of step up to that. So that's generally where I look to save a little bit of money. But yeah, Bruno was a mistake I made last year. Actually, I didn't pick him on overhaul because he started pretty poorly, and I thought I could get away with it, and I was punished pretty much instantly within the first 3 weeks. And as a result, I'd actually set my team up where I couldn't then sort it out and get back to him very easily without making multiple transfers. So I also then had to throw transfers at the problem. And, later on I paid for it because I didn't have the transfers left. So it was a massive error not going with him. And I do not think I'm going to make that mistake again.
Ouch. Yeah, that's painful. I mean, I've been there myself before, but somebody like Bruno, when he's firing, he can be getting 14, 15 point hauls week in, week out. And if you've not got him, 90 odd percent of the game does. So it's absolute double jeopardy for you. So yeah, I can only imagine how painful that was. Just before we move on to strikers, there's been some position changes, so this might not be truly reflective of last year, but which midfielder, right, who was a midfielder last season and is still a midfielder this season, do you think finished second to Bruno? This one surprised me, really.
Sorry, he was a midfielder and he's still a midfielder, did you say?
Was a midfielder last season, he's still a midfielder this season, and he finished second to Bruno.
Oh, God. Not Gundogan. EK
Not
Gundogan?
Gundogan. Not Gundogan. No, you were almost right. He was 3 points short of this player. Ward-Prowse.
Oh, of course, because he played every game, didn't he? If I remember right. Oh, yeah, he just ticked along. Yeah, I never had him in my team, I don't think. Did you?
I actually did. I had him for a little while, and he was okay. But it just shows that you don't have to be spectacular to rack up points. He's the kind of player that can get passing bonus and tackles occasionally. I mean, he might only score 5 or 6 goals over the course of the season, but he takes set pieces too. And he's exactly the kind of player that maybe in FPL you'd be unlikely to have him in. But certainly in Sky, he's a great option. So hopefully that just gives people the sense of the kind of players that are actually do very well in this game, and could be someone who we look back to again this year. So finally moving on to the strikers. I mean, this one should be pretty obvious as well.
Yeah, it's going to be Harry Kane, isn't it? Yeah, most goals, most assists. Was he the highest scorer in the game? I'm not sure if Bruno beat him or not, actually. I think.
Yeah, he was
Okay.
higher than Bruno.
Yeah, I think obviously things have changed this season around Kane. He's obviously been a very good Sky player to us over the seasons. He's had his off periods where we've kind of looked elsewhere, but it's a tricky one because he's 12 million, which is the most expensive player in the game. And I think I'll always try and save the money, or at least have the money available where I could get Harry Kane if I need him. I don't necessarily think I need him for the overhaul period. I know that's all we're talking about. But as a general strategy and the way you plan your team out, I like to have at least sort of 2 power forward slots available. So that would basically be Salah and Kane, which are 11.9 and 12. I would like my team to be set up in such a way that I could have both of those up front. Now that isn't... that can often mean sacrifices elsewhere and your team doesn't quite look as pretty, but I feel like that flexibility is very useful because if you just don't have that option, sometimes you'll talk yourself into turning down a sort of a 3-for-1 or something with a team because it's going to take too much surgery for you. And I feel like if you've got it available to you, it really is the smart thing to do on paper. So that's what I'll try to set my team up like that. I mean, you could always do just leave the 0.1 and maybe do a Salah to Kane. But I feel like when you start removing some of these players who can do it in any game, it can also bite you. So I don't know if you've got any particular strategy around that, or whether you follow that mantra, but that's what I try to set my team up like.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the way I would try and approach it. I think even though that's something you live by, you sometimes do veer away from it occasionally. And last year,
Mm.
I think I went through a long, long, long spell without Salah. Made a conscious decision that I was going to leave him out, and it worked for a long time. But then towards the end of the season, he just started bagging, and it was really difficult to go back on myself at that point because, as you say, you've set your team up to not do it, and in doing so, you've prevented yourself from getting there in one transfer, sometimes even two. So that's something you just got to be aware of, and I think as much budget flexibility as you can give yourself, as well as formation flexibility, because there are certain formations that you can't use. So 5-4-1 doesn't work, for example.
Mm.
Just making sure that you're able to move from a midfielder to a striker if you have to, and just give yourself that ability to move players without making multiple transfers every single time. But that's something we can maybe come on to a little bit more when we look past the overhaul. But thinking of the overhaul and talking about Kane, my view is that I might not start with him. He's got Man City in the first game, and generally, you don't want to make too many transfers before the end of the first overhaul. But there's a chance if you wanted to, you could start with Salah for Norwich, and I think it's Burnley they've got in the first two games, and then you could draft Kane in on Sunday the 22nd for Wolves and Watford at home, presuming he's still at Spurs. So this is another issue that we need to just make sure we're wary of before we do any planning, is that players can still move around. He's obviously been touted with moves elsewhere. And the game itself in 2 to 3 weeks' time will look completely different to how it does today. And so hopefully we'll get the chance before the season starts to really dive deep into the new transfers. And often players coming into the league who have never played in England before do get priced quite generously by Sky. I remember when Salah came in, he was 9.4, I think he was when he first joined, and that was a scandalously cheap price because he was the best player in the league. So yeah, that's something to be aware of, and we'll definitely take you all through that hopefully before the kickoff on the 13th of August.
Yeah, exactly. There's no point getting too much into it now because so much can change. That's why we're trying to avoid the player chat really if we can in this one. 6.7 million was the price of Santi Cazorla Narmathi, and he was one of the greatest Sky assets we've ever seen. I think that might have been, I don't know if it's the season I won or not won, came fourth or not. Maybe it was the season before that. But he hit 300 points, if I remember rightly, and this is before the passing bonus was set up exactly. It was something close to like 300 points, if I remember rightly. So crazy, 6.7 million. That was an absolute steal of a player. He was ridiculous in his first season for Arsenal, I think that was. So yeah, these things can happen, and they often get man of the match as well when they come to our league. If you've noticed, like a debut player, all the hysteria around him, they seem to pick that up. But yeah, with you, I'm not sure about Kane at the moment. Like you say, I tried to play the fixtures at the beginning. He is the best striker in the game. I think in the first 3 weeks, this is where you can take a chance on some of these players that Kane's probably going to be a large part of our seasons, be it at Man City, Spurs, wherever he is, regardless, he's just, too good of a player not to feature at some point, I would have thought. So it feels like where you can get away with it, where we've got like this forced overhaul that the fixtures haven't fallen too kindly, you can maybe get away with it. However, I think, is it the third game? Let me bring the fixtures back up again. They're at home to Watford on the very final day before the overhaul. That will be a very teasing game because we're going to go into that Sunday. The 2 o'clock kickoff is Burnley versus Leeds, and if you're sat there without Kane in your team, the temptation to bring him in will be great, I think, for a lot of people. And this is where this whole transfer usage scenario comes into it. If you've planned that previously, then maybe you'll do okay because Liverpool have got Chelsea on the Saturday, so maybe you don't fancy Salah in that one. But these are the things that torment us every single week, and hopefully me and Niall can provide some insight on our thought process as well. We certainly won't get it right every week, but we shall try our best for sure. Is there anything else you want to talk about, Niall? Anything you think we've missed for the first one?
Not particularly. I do think maybe looking at the fixtures, you talked a little bit about captaincies there. It looks pretty clear that by the first 3 weeks of the season, West Ham are really sticking out as a team that you might want to go in on early and have at least one player who's playing for them just to give you captain cover. They've got Newcastle on the first Sunday, and then they've got a standalone fixture against Leicester at home the week after. So that there's definitely a reason to have somebody like Antonio in your team, provided he's not injured early on. And alternatively, you could decide that you don't fancy Antonio, and you could maybe bring in a Leicester asset instead, and captain a Man City player on that Sunday. But this is the good thing about the overhaul, is that you can see the fixtures. You can set your team up to get to that first deadline of 3 weeks using as many transfers as you want. If you don't want to use any transfers, you can set your team up to use no transfers. You can give yourself a Brentford or an Arsenal player, a West Ham player, and probably a Man U player, and that'll cover you every single match day almost, to the overhaul. So I think just got to study the fixtures a little bit before the season kicks off, and just don't make the mistake of picking a team that you think is for the whole season, because you'll quickly realise that it's not.
Yeah, indeed. And this is the thing with Sky. Another thing is we get to see the lineups on certain days, so we can actually make transfers right up to the last minute for the first kickoff of that day. Sometimes that's of massive benefit, especially when Man City are the first game playing. For example, in the first sort of week there, we've got Newcastle versus West Ham, and they kick off right at the beginning. So, if you've got Antonio in your team and for whatever reason it's not starting, obviously you can then just move the captain to a Man City player if you've got one. So that's another benefit of it. Another thing I thought of is, and we did touch on it, is going all in on certain teams. There's no limit to the amount of players you can have from a specific team. So, if you really, really fancy Brighton, like a lot of people do for some clean sheets, or you just fancy them as a team because their fixtures are so good, likewise Aston Villa, Liverpool, it's a tricky balance sometimes of maybe not in this overhaul period, but after that, of how much you want to go in on these great teams. Like having tons of Man City players and Liverpool players is generally a pretty good idea, but then you're limiting yourself obviously on the amount of captains you can cover, because you obviously haven't got coverage from as many teams in the league as you could do, because technically you could have 11 players from 11 different teams, and then you probably keep your transfer usage reasonably well down. But is that the best choice? Do you want to have a Norwich player in your team, etc.? Probably not. So there's a tricky balance. We're going to talk you through it as we go. I think we'll wrap it up there. We've been going for 40 minutes now. Enjoyed that. Helped me sort of think through some things. Like I say, we shall try to bring you these on a weekly basis. We both got a holiday coming up, so that might cause us a little bit of problem in a little while. But the next one we're looking at will probably be maybe just sort of a price reaction one. We might go through the players and sort of just highlight some people we like. I know you've been doing that in the background, and I've actually flicked onto my team a couple of times here on the screens in the background, so you guys can have a sneak peek of what my team looks like at the moment. So we'll sort of talk through options like that. Sound good to you now?
Sounds absolutely ideal, and thanks for having me on. Looking forward to the season.
No problem, all good. Friendly reminder, guys, membership for Fantasy Football Scout. I think there's a deal on at the moment. Make sure you get yourself on the site. If you sign yourself up, all of the stats, the fixture ticker that you saw there, all come from the members area. We'll obviously delve a lot deeper into the stats when we move forward. And that, honestly, the fixture ticker is something I just use pretty much every week. I mean, I just use it all the time. I find it so handy. So I'm sure it will help you guys as well. And on the pass per 90-minute thing, I use quite often in the members area. So you can look at a specific set of players. You can look at how many passes they're getting per 90-minute appearance across the season, and see if they're hitting those thresholds regularly. So someone that stands out to me straight away is like Thiago Silva, is just off the charts for his passes per game. And you just pretty much know if he's playing, he's going to be hitting it, similar to Diaz, etc. So sometimes it sort of pulls up some gems, and I kind of use it as a fact checker, if you will. I have a player in mind. I feel like I want to get him, and then I'll delve into the stats and see whether my opinion appears to be right, or maybe there's another option there I haven't considered. So give that a thought, guys. And thanks for joining us, and we shall see you on the next one. See you later.
Bye bye.